etymologically to Chaco, Chaco meaning hunting grounds in Quechua. But I'll be talking about a little bit further south. So last year I was able to return to a field site that I had worked at briefly as a graduate student 13 years ago. And I was able to replicate a study that I had done then with the help of my co-authors, Antonia Barron, who was here. You can meet her yourself later. And a Pocinjo, who was our, not only our gracious hostess, both in 1998 and last year in 2011, but also really foundationally guided the research in terms of framing the interactions with the children that we interviewed and also helping us set up the plant trail that I'll be talking about today. So, this is a Pocinjo on the right. We were at, I included this picture because we had gone to a botanical gardens. It was what everyone wanted to do when we took a trip to the big city in Asunción. And I also wanted to acknowledge Upusia Humine, who's in the middle here, and her husband and children are also really foundational for guiding the work in 1998. I'm going to see if the audio works in a minute, but I also just wanted to acknowledge something that's somewhat intangible, but I'm sure all of you who've worked in local communities has experienced the way that an elder or just a very knowledgeable person can hold the space for knowledge, can hold space for learning in a certain kind of way. And so I wanted to dedicate this to Pua, who is one of our authors' sister. And she passed away a couple years ago. And there were many, many hours of sitting with her 13 years ago on my behalf, learning how to do the bromelia fiber twining that she's doing in this picture. And she was able to frame for me the way in which plant knowledge is embedded in practices and relationships with the plants, as many people have been talking about so far. How to treat plants, what to avoid, what not to avoid, the positions one's body should be in when interacting with certain plants, that kind of thing. So we'll see if this works. The song you'll hear next is sung by a year ago, a little less than a year ago, and I'm including it as well to try to get a little bit further dimensionality to the experience of this particular place in the Paraguayan Chaco. Now, I should mention that songs are used very frequently, almost on a daily basis, certainly on a weekly basis now, and are used to commemorate all kinds of activities, good harvests, exciting hunts, love stories, sicknesses, and are really a daily practice that brings back cultural memories and particular memories of landscape. And it's not playing, it might not. Might not be connected here to the audio properly. Well, if anyone's interested in Ayoreo song narratives, you can contact me later. Also wanted to acknowledge, of course, all the children who made this possible. And as you can see, there were multitudes of children who were very enthusiastic, really, about doing the plant trail and being our teachers. So the area that I'm talking about is up here in what's sometimes called the ombligo, or the belly button, South America. Paraguay is landlocked, except for the Paraguay River, which comes down into the Atlantic. And the northern part of Paraguay is mostly taken up by this Chaco. Northern and western is the Chaco region. This map shows deforestation between 1990 and 2000. The pink areas are deforested. If you can extrapolate that to another 10 years, it's probably at least as much pink and probably twice as much pink in there. Another way of showing that is just this drastic decline in forest over the past decades. So what we're seeing is in the past 13 years between when I first went there and then came back last year, a drastic reconfiguration of the landscape from multi-story xerophytic forests to these strips of basically pasture monocultures for ranching and beef export. These maps were done by Iniciativa Anthropogenic to show some of the best understanding we have of traditional Ayoreo territories in the 1950s, and a mere 60 years later, we see that the shrinking radically of Ayoreo-owned land. It's a large area. Now, this map up here includes Ayoreo territories in Bolivia, and they're all added up. It's almost the size of Uruguay or Ecuador. It's quite a big chunk of South America. So one of the things I wanted to point out is that the study that we did is working with people who now live further south, but they originally come from Choforeca area, many of them, which is further up here, close to the Bolivia border, and is a lot wetter, a lot more biodiverse, and a lot more easy pickings to live sustainably. Down here is a lot drier and somewhat different vegetation. Down here is where they live now. Another thing that when one considers change over time and knowledge, really have to acknowledge the recent history, in this case, recent very traumatic history in this for Ayoreo cultural histories. And for the most part in Paraguay, this has been silent and not talked about, in part because it was a lot of the horrific tragedies that happened in the last 50 years happened under the Stroessner dictatorship, and really we're drawing on deeper histories of Spanish relations with indigenous groups that were Guarani in Paraguay. Basically the Ayoreo had been named since the 1500s. They were called Moros, or Moors. So even going deeper into the imported ethnic stereotypes or assumptions that were brought by the Spanish and then were imposed on the Ayoreo in their relationship. Jose Kebi has recently broken that silence by publishing this book last year, along with an anthropologist, Daisy Amarilla, that is his memoir, basically, of being kidnapped as a child, a 12-year-old in 1956, and taken from his family's homeland, and it was by Paraguayan ranchers. He was put in a cage, taken to the city, and exhibited for money until Salesian missionaries rescued him but then employed him as go-between to go back in to the northern Chaco forest and try to bring out his family and other family members, or other Ayoreo families. So he talks about this process, and at the time this was not illegal. There was actually an official government bounty on Ayoreo heads in the 50s. So this is very recent history, and it means that when we're studying generational change of knowledge, we really have to take into account this experience of trauma that people in Jose Kebi's generation really brought with them out of the forest and into their present lives. So the community of Jesudi looks pretty much like this. This is a picture of Quince de Septiembre, which is a daughter community of Jesudi, and we worked with both of these communities. We completed these plant trail interviews. So So we tried to keep the replication of the plant trail interviews as similar as possible. So in 1998, I had done the interviews, and the oversight was by A.E. Bocinco. In 2011, interviews were done by Antonio Barro, and the oversight was by both A.E. and myself. The 33 plant specimens were identified along the trail to be asked about. Basically, we were asking for names and uses, but the kids were mostly scored on names. And in 2011, we were able to only find 30. I'll talk about that in a minute, why all the plant species were not there anymore. We pretty much interviewed all of the children that wanted to, so it was pretty, somewhere in the 90s, 90% sample of all the kids in the community. There were one or two maybe who declined and didn't want to participate. And then in 2011, we also had the opportunity to do something that is really rare in anthropology. I hardly ever get to go back and interview the same people who I had interviewed as kids in '98, and now they're young adults. So we'll treat those two a little separately. This is the beginning of the plant trail. It's in A's home area, and as you can see, an area of intense sociality and also quite close to the surrounding vegetation. This is a picture of the plant trail from '98, and we selected plants, or I and A.E. selected plants for the trail, basically framed by A.E. as plants that children should know. So they included mostly wild edibles, mostly wild craft and material plants, just a few medicinals, and a few domesticated agricultural plants. This is the end of the trail, so basically it was a big loop about 1 kilometer long. And this is in Jose Ikebi's house compound. And answers that the children had given were just checked with the parents and talked about and discussed a little bit, interpreted in the house afterwards. So what I'd like to do is just use this data as a springboard, really, to explore more qualitatively some of the aspects of life history and understanding the landscape and livelihoods. So these blue ones are the results from '98. The red ones are from 2011. And what we see is that when we talk about a decline in knowledge, I'd never thought about this before, but we're actually, geometrically speaking, we're talking about a decline in the angle of the learning curve. So here, kids were still basically learning about the same level, but it was just taking them another 10 years or so. So whereas in '98, kids were often at a competency level similar to adults by age 10, 11, 12. Now, it takes, not everyone is getting there, but maybe it takes until young adulthood. If we group all of the answers by age groups, we can see a little clearer what the overall difference is. So again, these are just raw scores of number of plants that children were able to identify. And we can see that in almost each age group, the present day population of kids and young adults knows about half or less than half than they did in the previous generation. Now, in this community, it is the case that, for the most part, these are the children of these people. So many of them, one of the people that I interviewed 13 years ago now have children that we interviewed again. So we're looking at really 3 generations. The parents, the parents in 1998 who are now in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and then the parents who were kids when I knew them in '98, their kids. So moving now to looking at the 13 people we were able to find and agreed to do the interview again as young adults. For the most part, as we would expect, they all increased in knowledge. So this is their age when they were, in 1998, they were 3 years old. Now they know that many plants, and we'll have 5 more in this case, here 15 more. So as expected, most people know more now that they're older. But there were a few cases that were really quite notable in the fact that they forgot plants that they had known when they were kids, and then now scored lower. And so here we can use this kind of data as a prompt to go to our ethnographic understanding, because we've spent time and we've asked people about their lives, and we have a little bit of a sense of what their life histories are like, to start to look at some possible reasons. So I'm just going to highlight one. This is A's, one of our co-authors' daughter, her only daughter. And when she was 10, she scored the highest of all the children in the study. In part, I attributed that to she hung out with AE a lot. She participated in subsistence activities. She liked to go into the forest and look for wild foods with her mom. And she also thought it was cool. She valued it. She really appreciated and would talk about wild plants and wild plant knowledge. Now, she's a young adult of 23 years old. She has young babies of her own. And she also, among everyone in the community, she's a person that has lived outside of the community in Asunción, in the big city. And she probably speaks Spanish better than anyone else in the community. And she's married a Paraguayan as well, who lives in Jesudi, in this community with her. But that's quite unusual. He's the only one. And now, she was really kind of embarrassed. She kept telling us, well, I'm going to do really badly on this test. I know, I'm going to do really badly because I've forgotten all the plants. So it's quite interesting to see how the affect towards plant knowledge has changed as well. This is A5. Here she's making plant salt, or choy, which as a practice for obtaining salt is very rare anymore. Nobody does it unless they're really far away from the community and didn't bring salt with them. But there are 2 or 3 plant species involved here that burn together, and then you can eat the ashes as a salty supplement. And included as an example of the way that livelihoods have changed. There's some fundamental aspects of making a living and creating your life story that just are not practicable anymore. As you saw in the amount of land, the landscape that's available to people to access wild foods is highly constricted. When A was a child, she grew up moving around, basically with her family seasonally in search of foods or to their gardening or fishing areas. Now they have one plot of land, and that's it. They don't have anywhere to move to. The only place that they could go to is Choboreca, which, as you saw, is very far away and is very costly because you have to pay for the gas to get there. We also see now that the next generation of basically the children of AE's generation have encountered a lot of social prejudice. There's still very common prevailing attitude in Paraguay that of a kind of a barbarism or otherness that is Ayoreo. And forced foods and identity as through food practice is very much tied into that. So AE has found that she says no one wants to come to the bush anymore. She loves to go daily, if she could, into the bush to get wild foods. But she's finding that none of the younger generation want to come, and many of her peers can't come for various reasons. They're getting older, or they have other obligations. One of the ways people have dealt with this, the women especially, have created an economic activity in the form of creating bromeliad fiber crafts. This has been going on for several decades. But they've mostly harvested out the bromelia in their immediate areas, and now they have to travel. Again, it costs gas to travel farther and farther away from the small plots of land where they live in order to get the bromelia and to process it into crafts for sale. Here's another contrast. In 1998, people were, men primarily, were extracting Palo Santo or Bulnesia, which is an ironwood, extremely aromatic, beautiful, beautiful wood. You can see also that these were cut by axe and these are cut by chainsaw. And they were, sadly enough, they deforested their entire area in the immediate community in order to supply the local Mennonite electric plant. They were burning this ironwood for electricity. That ended in 1998, but meanwhile it deforested an enormous amount of the Chaco. This is Keneha. This is the only daughter of A'i, who scored so highly the first time and so low the second. And this is her son, Uno, and they're almost the same age in these pictures. So you can see that just the amount of value of the wood has gone down a great deal in this photo. By the way, what they're doing here is sticking sticks into holes in the wood and draw them out and they get honey from small melopone bees. This is Choki, one of the people who's very helpful to us as well. And he's surrounded, this is a chakra, this is a garden. He's surrounded by invasive buffalo grass and panic grass, which, again, is totally taking over this landscape. It's changed the landscape drastically and changes the fire regime as well. So we can think about the colonial process, the historical processes, these people-plant complexes that come in to change landscape. So in this case, Mennonite sensibilities changing the Chaco landscape and bringing with it introductions of particular plants like this buffalo grass and panic grass that radically change. And we'll just continue. This is the last slide. It is one example that life history interviews with AE. She talked about, and this is something that I don't think is published in the literature, but she talked about these anthropogenic groves that her father would go to when she was a child living in the forest, called abues. And basically what they were practicing is apiculture. They had made hollows in the kukoi, the samu trees, and by placing sticks within there, they're able to cultivate honey. And then they would leave them there for years, sometimes even generations. But people would know, they would have mental maps of where to go back to. And as you said, we knew that there were these groves that were made by men from long before our times. And that became part of their landscape of food practices to go back to. So I'll just leave it there with A's own words. And I think when we have an opening for one of the canceled talks, we could ask questions if you have any. That's why I mean, it's important. Thank you.